Hi everyone. I decided to make this short video to explain the ending of To Kill a Mockingbird because when I was reading your notes for the week, there seemed to sometimes be a little bit of confusion, especially with the scene when Heck and Atticus are talking on the porch about Bob's death and so forth. I'm going to show you some pictures from the movie version. And, as we know in this ending part of the story, Bob is mentioned as kind of roaming around Maycomb with an attitude. He always has an attitude, and he has a bit of a vendetta against the Finches. Here's a very amusing picture of him from the movie where he's sort of lurching at them. And we know that he attacks Scout and Jem after the Halloween pageant in the wooded area in their walk home. Um, and so he carries Scout back, not Scout, Jem, sorry. He carries Jem back, who had been injured. His arm had been injured, and Scout makes her way all shaken up and makes her way back home on her own. And then as she's checking in on Jim to see how he is after the attack, she spots Boo, and this is how he was depicted in the movie version. I know that the actor died, or not died, but bleached his hair to be pale because we know he never went outside, very rarely. So basically, this all leads up to this big conversation between Atticus and Heck. There's Atticus, there's the sheriff, Heck, there's Scout and Boo hanging out on the front porch. So Atticus tries to put the blame on Jem because Jem is only 12 or so at the time, and he would be defending himself and his sister, and he very likely wouldn't have any horrible punishment happen to him if he was the one who had attacked Bob in defense. But Heck, the sheriff, he very strongly opposes Atticus putting this forth, and he just really insists that Jem didn't do it, and we know that Jem didn't do it. And so Bob, um, Boo was the one ultimately who killed Bob. He came out of nowhere because he's sort of we sort of figure out that he's been this kind of watchdog for the kids. He was the one who put the blanket on Scout when everyone was watching the fire at Miss Maudie's house. And, he's basically been watching the whole story. So just as we've viewed the story of To Kill a Mockingbird through Scout's eyes, we kind of learned that Boo has been there all along in the background watching everything unfold too. And I'll say more about that in a little bit. But this slide here, that's Scout in her ham costume. That's Bob right here and Boo. So this little slide says Boo Radley saved Scout and Jem the Halloween pageant night, and Mr. Yule was killed to prevent any further attacks. And you could still argue that this was a kind of defense for sure on Boo's part. And so Heck and Atticus are wrestling with the knowledge that Boo is responsible for this. And let's say he had no criminal charges placed against him and the whole thing was found out to be defense. Well, think about what would happen. The town would want to celebrate Boo and hold him up as a hero, as having rescued and saved these two young kids. So we learn that he isn't a monster, and we were getting that idea for a while, but we definitely know that by now. So what the two men decide is especially what Hex says. He says, "Let the dead bury the dead," because Tom Robinson had died, and now Bob had died. And who was initially, in a sense, responsible for Tom Robinson's death? But Bob, right? So if the men pretend or just tell everyone that Bob fell on his own knife. That keeps things very simple and it's not hurting anyone, essentially. Because if Boo was in the spotlight, that would hurt him more than anything, really, because he can't live that kind of life. So Scout is clearly not afraid of Boo anymore. And what happens towards the end is she walks, this is, I think, right after she walks him home back to his house, the very house that she was so afraid in the beginning to even walk by. And now she escorts him there. And then there's the scene where she's basically playing back the whole story to some extent. She's standing on the Radleys' porch and she's thinking back to the fall and the winter and all the events that had transpired. And we now get to see Scout growing up a little bit, and she's able to step into Boo's shoes, or at least step onto his porch, right? So she gets to see what he saw, what viewpoint he was at when he saw everything happening in Maycomb. So that's important. And the story ends entirely, the last chapter, with the scene with Scout and Atticus, where she's going to bed and she wants him to read her a bedtime story. And she picks one that he thinks is going to be a little bit scary, but she says, well, I'm not scared anymore. And the story ends up having a character in it who's sort of misunderstood. And Scout points out that people really aren't so bad, or they can be really good when you actually get to know them. And here's the quote on the screen here. Atticus, he was real nice. Most people are, Scout, when you finally see them. And the thing to realize here is that Atticus isn't the one educating Scout about this for once. She's the one pointing it out to her father. And so that is trying to say that the book comes to an end with Scout growing up and being able to identify that kind of empathy within herself, using it on others. And the reader of the book should understand that she's going to carry that out throughout her life moving forward. So if you just kind of read it at first glance, it seems like, okay, now she's going to bed and her dad's reading her a story, good night, the book is finished. But when you stop to think about it, it does show us her growth. If you just peel back a little bit of a layer, and she's maturing. And I think that's the message that the author, Harper Lee, really wants to give us. So that's what I wanted to share with you. I hope that that cleared up the ending for you. And you've been hopefully working on your own story from a childhood memory. And so you want to be thinking about writing a scene of something that happened to you, kind of in the style of Scout narrating what happened to her in her childhood, because we think of the novel as being written by her older self. She has her older perspective to be able to look back, and she has more of a sense of maturity that she can reflect on those experiences and explain what they meant to her to some extent. With that time passing, you're able to process things and you can pick out meanings better, rather than when you're younger and things are happening right away. You don't always know what things mean right away. That's just not how things work. So we're trying to use this story as an inspiration for you to do the same. And you want to make sure not to forget at the very end of your story, or at least by the end of the story, if it's not threaded throughout, you have to have a little bit of a reflection piece to do just that, to share your thoughts now on yourself back then. And again, I gave you the model of the story that I wrote about me being on the playground for you to look back at as a reference. Okay, so that is all. Bye-bye.